In the remote stretches of West Texas in 1881, where the land was so dry that cattle bones bleached white in a matter of weeks, and the nearest neighboring town sat 47 miles away across territory that killed travelers with disturbing regularity, there existed a settlement that locals referred to simply as Redemption. The town had been founded in 1869 by Confederate veterans who sought to build a new society far from federal oversight. And by 1881, it had grown to a population of approximately 340 souls, most of whom worked in the silver mines that honeycombed the surrounding hills or raised livestock on hardscrabble ranches that barely produced enough to sustain their families. Redemption sat in a natural basin, surrounded by red rock formations that gave the landscape an almost hellish appearance at sunset. And the isolation was so complete that mail arrived only twice monthly via a stagecoach that frequently turned back due to Apache raiding parties that controlled much of the surrounding territory. What the outside world didn't know was that Redemption operated under a system of justice that had evolved far beyond the rough frontier law common to such settlements, transforming into something that would have been unrecognizable to any legitimate court of law. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and if this is your first time on our channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that official history preferred to forget. Sheriff Jacob Thorne had arrived in Redemption in 1870. A tall man with shoulders like an axe handle and eyes the color of gunmetal that never seemed to blink when he looked at you. He claimed to have been a captain in the Confederate Army, though no one could verify this, and he wore a silver star that he said had belonged to his father, who had been a Texas Ranger before the war. Thorne was 31 years old when he became sheriff, elected by the town council in a vote that was more coronation than democratic process, and he immediately established a reputation for maintaining order through methods that were both effective and deeply unsettling. He never raised his voice, never showed anger, never displayed any emotion whatsoever when dealing with prisoners or investigating crimes, approaching law enforcement with the clinical detachment of a surgeon performing an amputation. Mayor Samuel Wickham had founded Redemption alongside Thorne, and the two men shared a bond that went beyond simple friendship or political alliance. Wickham was shorter than the sheriff, compact and muscular, with a full beard that he kept meticulously groomed and hands that were surprisingly delicate for a man who had spent years working manual labor in mining camps across the West. He was 28 years old in 1881, 3 years younger than Thorne, and he ran the town with an attention to detail that bordered on obsessive, maintaining ledgers that documented every transaction, every dispute, every minor infraction of the community's growing body of regulations. Wickham had studied law for 2 years at a college in Virginia before the war interrupted his education, and he brought to Redemption a veneer of legal legitimacy that masked something far darker beneath the surface of proper procedure and documented proceedings. The town's courthouse occupied the center of Redemption's Main Street, a 2-story wooden structure that was substantially larger than necessary for a settlement of its size. The building had been constructed during the town's first year, suggesting that the founders had always intended it to serve as something more than a simple administrative office. The ground floor contained the courtroom itself, with wooden benches for spectators, a judge's bench elevated 3 feet above the floor, and a defendant's box positioned directly in front of the judge where the accused would stand during proceedings. But it was the second floor that gave the building its true purpose: a large dining hall with a table capable of seating 20 people, crystal chandeliers imported from New Orleans at considerable expense, and a kitchen area that was equipped far beyond what would be necessary for simple town meetings or social gatherings. The courthouse basement had been excavated to a depth of 12 feet, creating a storage area that remained cool even during the brutal Texas summers, with thick walls and a heavy door that could be locked from the outside. Dr. I.S. Cole had arrived in Redemption in 1875, drawn by advertisements in Eastern newspapers that promised opportunities for physicians willing to relocate to frontier settlements. He was then 36 years old, recently widowed, and seeking to escape memories that haunted him in Philadelphia, where he had practiced medicine for nearly a decade. Cole was a small man with wire-rimmed spectacles and hands that trembled slightly when he wasn't actively engaged in medical work, a nervous condition that had developed after his wife's death from typhoid fever. He established his practice in a building adjacent to the courthouse, and for the first year his work consisted primarily of treating mining injuries, delivering babies, and managing the various ailments common to frontier life. But in the winter of 1876, Sheriff Thorne approached him with a proposition that would fundamentally alter the nature of his medical practice. The sheriff explained that Redemption needed a town physician who could serve in an official capacity during legal proceedings, someone who could examine prisoners, certify causes of death, and provide medical testimony when required. The position came with a substantial salary paid directly from town funds, along with a house provided at no cost and priority access to supplies that arrived via the monthly stagecoach. Dr. Cole accepted the position, grateful for the financial security and professional recognition, not yet understanding what his official duties would actually entail. The first indication that something was wrong came 3 months after Cole accepted his position as town physician. A man named William McCarthy had been arrested for stealing 3 horses from the town stable, a serious crime in a settlement where livestock represented both transportation and capital. McCarthy was 23 years old, a drifter who had arrived in Redemption 2 months earlier, claiming to be looking for mining work, and he had no family or connections to advocate on his behalf. The trial was held on a Tuesday morning in March, with Mayor Wickham presiding as judge and Sheriff Thorne presenting evidence that included the testimony of 3 witnesses who claimed to have seen McCarthy leading the horses away from the stable at night. The proceedings followed proper legal procedure with surprising attention to detail. Wickham questioned the defendant, allowed him to present his defense, which consisted of a claim that he had been paid to move the horses by someone he couldn't identify, and deliberated for exactly 15 minutes before rendering a verdict of guilty. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn the following day. Dr. Cole attended the execution as required by his position, standing beside the gallows platform to certify the death and ensure that proper procedures were followed. What he witnessed that morning would haunt him for the remainder of his life, though at the time he convinced himself that he had simply misunderstood what he saw. The hanging itself proceeded normally. McCarthy dropped through the trapdoor and died within minutes from a broken neck, his body swaying gently in the cold morning wind. But rather than allowing the undertaker to remove the body for burial, Sheriff Thorne calmly cut the rope and carried McCarthy's corpse to a wagon that was waiting behind the gallows. Dr. Ronald Cole watched as the wagon, driven by Mayor Wickham, proceeded not toward the town cemetery but toward the courthouse, and something ice-cold settled in his stomach, though he couldn't quite articulate why the sight disturbed him so deeply. That evening, Dr. Cole was invited to dinner at the courthouse, along with 12 other prominent members of the Redemption community. The invitation specified formal attire and arrival at precisely 7 p.m., and Cole assumed this was some sort of town council meeting or social gathering to discuss community business. He arrived punctually to find the second-floor dining hall illuminated by dozens of candles, the long table set with fine china and silver that seemed incongruous with the rough frontier setting. The other guests included the owners of Redemption's 3 largest mining operations, the president of the town's only bank, the editor of the weekly newspaper, and several successful ranchers whose properties surrounded the town. They were all men. No women had been invited, and they greeted each other with a familiarity that suggested this was not their first such gathering. Mayor Wickham welcomed the guests and explained that tonight's dinner was both a celebration of justice served and an initiation for Dr. Cole into what he called the Brotherhood of Redemption, a group of men who understood that true civilization required sacrifices that weaker souls could not stomach. The first course arrived, a rich soup served in fine porcelain bowls, and the men began eating while discussing business matters and town politics in casual conversation. It wasn't until the main course was served that Dr. Cole began to suspect that something was profoundly wrong. The meat was prepared in a style he didn't recognize. carefully arranged on each plate with vegetables and garnishes that demonstrated considerable culinary skill. And it had a flavor that was simultaneously familiar and completely foreign to his palate. He had eaten perhaps 3 bites when Sheriff Thorne stood at the head of the table and explained, in the same emotionless tone he used when reading arrest warrants, that the meal they were consuming had been prepared from William McCarthy, the horse thief whose execution had been carried out that morning. The Brotherhood, Thorne continued calmly, had been established by the town's founders as a means of ensuring that justice and redemption served multiple purposes: punishment for criminals, nourishment for the community's leaders, and a sacred bond among those who truly understood the necessities of frontier survival. Dr. Cole felt his throat constrict and his vision narrow to a tunnel, the room seeming to recede even as the other men continued eating and nodding along with Thorne's explanation, as if the sheriff were describing nothing more unusual than a new tax policy or zoning regulation. Several guests complimented the preparation of the meat, with one rancher noting that it was considerably more tender than the beef his property produced. And Mayor Wickham explained that proper aging and preparation were essential to achieving optimal results. The Brotherhood had developed techniques over the preceding 12 years, refining their methods through trial and error until they had achieved what Wickham described as a perfect synthesis of justice and sustenance. The mayor went on to explain, while methodically cutting another piece of meat, that not every convicted criminal was suitable for their purposes. The Brotherhood maintained strict standards regarding health, age, and the nature of the crime committed. Only those who had committed offenses that genuinely harmed the community were selected. An extensive medical examination was required to ensure the meat would be safe for consumption. This was why Dr. Cole's participation was so essential. His medical expertise would help the Brotherhood expand their practices while maintaining the safety standards that had allowed them to continue undetected for over a decade. Cole sat frozen in his chair, the partially eaten meal sitting before him like physical evidence of his unwitting participation in something that defied every principle of medicine, law, and basic humanity. He wanted to stand, to leave, to report what he had learned to federal authorities in the nearest legitimate town. But Mayor Wickham calmly explained that Dr. Cole had now consumed the evidence himself, making him legally complicit in the Brotherhood's activities, and that any attempt to expose them would result in his own arrest and execution under Texas law. Furthermore, Wickham added while refilling Cole's wine glass, there were no federal authorities with jurisdiction over redemption. The town existed in a legal gray area due to unclear territorial boundaries and the ongoing Apache conflicts that kept government officials far from this remote region. The Brotherhood had been operating since 1869, conducting trials and executions that followed proper legal procedure in every detail except for what happened to the bodies afterward. And they had processed 47 individuals over those 12 years without arousing any external suspicion. The group met quarterly for formal banquets following executions, but they also distributed portions of the meat to other Brotherhood members who couldn't attend the dinners, ensuring that justice literally nourished the entire leadership structure of redemption. Dr. Cole learned over the following months that the Brotherhood's membership extended beyond redemption itself, including prominent citizens from 3 neighboring settlements and even 2 judges who presided over courts in larger Texas towns. The network had been established by Confederate veterans who shared both a commitment to maintaining order in the lawless territories and a belief that certain ancient practices, abandoned by modern civilization, actually represented superior wisdom about the relationship between justice and survival. They kept meticulous records of every trial, every execution, and every subsequent distribution of meat, documenting their activities with a bureaucratic attention to detail that would have been admirable in any other context. The ledger was stored in Mayor Wickham's office, a massive volume bound in dark leather that stood nearly 2 feet tall, and it contained entries dating back to the Brotherhood's founding with notations about each individual processed, the crime committed, the date of execution, and detailed information about the subsequent preparation and distribution. The system operated with mechanical efficiency that transformed atrocity into administrative procedure. Sheriff Thorne would arrest individuals accused of serious crimes. Mayor Wickham would conduct trials that followed proper legal procedure with testimony, cross-examination, and formal deliberation. And upon conviction and execution, Dr. Cole would perform medical examination to ensure the body was suitable for processing. A butcher named Ernest Halloway, who had learned his trade in a Chicago slaughterhouse before moving west, handled the actual preparation of the meat, working in the courthouse basement where temperature and humidity could be carefully controlled. Halloway approached his work with professional pride, explaining to Dr. Cole during one uncomfortable conversation that proper butchering required extensive anatomical knowledge, and that he had spent years perfecting techniques for processing different cuts to maximize both flavor and efficiency. The meat was aged for specific periods depending on the season, smoked or salted for preservation, and distributed according to a complex hierarchy that reflected each Brotherhood member's status within the organization. During the spring of 1877, something happened that revealed the true extent of the Brotherhood's reach and the impossibility of escaping their network. A traveling preacher named Reverend Thomas Ashford arrived in Redemption, part of a circuit that took him through remote settlements across West Texas, bringing religious services to isolated communities. Ashford was 41 years old, a Methodist minister who had been educated at a seminary in Tennessee, and he possessed both genuine religious conviction and a troubling tendency to speak out against injustice wherever he encountered it. He had been in Redemption for less than a week when he began asking questions about the unusually high rate of executions, the absence of any appeals process, and the fact that executed prisoners' bodies were never properly buried in the town cemetery. Sheriff Thorne arrested Reverend Ashford on charges of vagrancy and disturbing the peace, and Mayor Wickham scheduled a trial for the following morning. Dr. Cole, who had been hoping that someone from outside Redemption might finally expose the Brotherhood's activities, watched with growing horror as Ashford's trial proceeded through all the proper legal procedures, complete with witness testimony about the preacher's alleged disruption of town business and inflammatory accusations against local officials. Ashford defended himself eloquently, arguing that his questions were protected by constitutional rights and that the charges were transparently designed to silence legitimate criticism. Mayor Wickham listened patiently, took notes, and ultimately found the Reverend guilty, sentencing him to death by hanging for the crime of criminal libel and conspiracy to damage the town's reputation. The execution was scheduled for dawn, and that evening, the Brotherhood gathered for another formal dinner. Reverend Ashford was hanged the next morning, still proclaiming his innocence and calling upon God to judge those who had condemned him. His body was processed according to the Brotherhood's established procedures, and 2 days later, Dr. Cole sat at another dinner where the preacher's flesh was served alongside potatoes and vegetables grown in Redemption's community garden. Mayor Wickham gave a toast to the preservation of order and the elimination of those who would undermine the society they had built, and the assembled men raised their glasses in agreement. It was during this dinner that Cole finally understood there would be no external intervention, no rescue from federal authorities, no possibility of justice being served through official channels. The Brotherhood had operated for 8 years by the time Cole learned of their existence, and they showed no signs of concern about discovery. They had processed a Methodist minister, a representative of established religious authority, without any apparent fear of consequences, suggesting that their network extended far enough to protect them from investigation. Dr. Cole began keeping his own private journal, documenting everything he learned about the Brotherhood's operations with the vague hope that this information might someday be discovered and used to bring them to justice. He recorded dates, names, details about trial procedures, and information about the Brotherhood's membership that now included over 30 individuals across 4 Texas counties. The journal was written in a cipher he had learned during his medical training, a substitution code that would require considerable effort to crack, but would protect the information if the document was discovered before he could deliver it to legitimate authorities. He hid the journal in a cavity he carved into the wall behind a bookshelf in his office, covering the opening with a false panel that appeared to be part of the original construction. Throughout 1877 and into 1878, Cole maintained his position as town physician and brotherhood member while secretly documenting their activities and searching for some way to escape redemption without being caught. He knew that anyone who attempted to leave the town unexpectedly would be arrested on fabricated charges and subjected to the same fate as Reverend Ashford. The Brotherhood monitored all departures from redemption with the same bureaucratic efficiency they applied to their legal proceedings, requiring any traveler to obtain written permission from the mayor's office and providing detailed explanation of their destination and purpose for leaving. Several individuals who had tried to leave without permission over the years had been found dead along the trails leading away from town, their deaths attributed to Apache raids or simple misfortune. Though Cole now suspected the Brotherhood had arranged these incidents to maintain control over information flow. The one potential escape route involved the quarterly visits from a federal census taker named Marcus Webb, who traveled through remote Texas settlements gathering population data and economic information for government records. Webb was due to visit Redemption in September 1878, and Dr. Cole began planning to somehow pass information to the census taker without being detected by the Brotherhood's surveillance network. He prepared a shortened version of his journal that could be easily concealed and quickly transferred, focusing on the most crucial evidence of the Brotherhood's activities, including names, dates, and enough detail to justify a federal investigation. The document was written on thin paper that could be folded into a small packet, and Cole practiced transferring it in various scenarios, trying to find a method that wouldn't attract attention from the ever-present eyes of Brotherhood members who seemed to monitor every interaction in town. Marcus Webb arrived in Redemption on September 23, 1878. A clerk-like man of 38 years with thinning hair and spectacles similar to Cole's, carrying a leather satchel filled with government forms and previous census data. He followed his standard procedure of meeting with Mayor Wickham to discuss the town's current population and economic status, then conducting individual interviews with prominent citizens to gather more detailed information. Dr. Cole's interview was scheduled for the afternoon of Webb's second day in town, and Cole prepared himself for what he knew would be his only opportunity to pass information without being observed. But when Webb arrived at Cole's office for the interview, the census taker was accompanied by Sheriff Thorne, who explained casually that he was present to assist with any questions Webb might have about town residents or recent deaths that needed to be documented for federal records. Cole conducted the interview with Thorne standing silently beside the door, his presence making it impossible to pass any information to Webb without immediate detection. The doctor answered questions about Redemption's population health, mortality rates, and medical conditions prevalent in the region, watching his carefully planned escape opportunity evaporate as Webb thanked him politely and departed with Sheriff Thorne still accompanying him. That evening, Mayor Wickham summoned Dr. Cole to his office and calmly explained that they had been aware of his journal for several months, having discovered it during a routine search of his premises that the Brotherhood conducted periodically for all members. Wickham placed the journal on his desk, still in its cipher, and noted that while they hadn't yet broken the code, the mere existence of such a document represented a serious breach of trust. However, the mayor continued, the Brotherhood believed in redemption, hence the town's name, and they were willing to give Cole an opportunity to demonstrate his genuine commitment to their cause. The next trial was scheduled for the following week, and Dr. Cole would not merely attend as medical examiner. He would serve as prosecutor, presenting evidence and arguing for conviction before Mayor Wickham rendered judgment. The defendant was Marcus Webb, the federal census taker, who had been arrested that afternoon on charges of espionage and conspiracy to provide false information to federal authorities about Redemption's population and activities. Cole felt his blood turn to ice as he realized the Brotherhood had anticipated his attempt to pass information and had used Webb's visit as a test of his loyalty. The census taker was being sacrificed specifically to force Cole's active participation in the Brotherhood's activities, transforming him from an unwilling observer into a direct participant in the legal proceedings that led to these ritual executions. He could refuse, which would result in his own immediate arrest and execution, or he could serve as prosecutor, definitively crossing a line that would eliminate any remaining illusion that he was somehow morally separate from the Brotherhood's atrocities. Mayor Wickham waited patiently while Dr. Cole processed this choice, then added one final detail. If Cole served effectively as prosecutor and secured a conviction, the Brotherhood would destroy his journal and consider his loyalty proven, allowing him to remain in redemption as a trusted member. But if he refused, both he and Webb would be executed, and the Brotherhood would continue operating exactly as before, simply recruiting a new physician to replace him. The trial of Marcus Webb took place on October 1, 1878, and Dr. Cole stood before the court and presented fabricated evidence that the census taker had been systematically misrepresenting Redemption's population data to federal authorities as part of a conspiracy to deny the town access to federal resources and territorial recognition. He called witnesses who provided perjured testimony about Webb's suspicious behavior and alleged meetings with individuals outside town limits. He argued passionately for conviction, using legal arguments he had learned from observing Mayor Wickham's prosecutorial techniques. And he watched as the census taker's desperate attempts to defend himself were methodically dismissed by Wickham's procedural rulings. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death, and Webb was hanged 3 days later after Dr. Cole examined him and certified that he was physically fit for execution. The formal dinner was held that evening, and this time Dr. Cole ate the meal fully aware of what he was consuming, understanding that he had now crossed into active complicity and could never claim ignorance or coercion as justification for his actions. The Brotherhood welcomed him as a proven member, and Mayor Wickham personally destroyed his journal in the courthouse fireplace, burning the carefully documented evidence that might have exposed their activities. Over the following 3 years, Dr. Cole served as prosecutor in 17 trials, securing convictions in every case and participating in the subsequent ritual dinners, where the executed were consumed according to the Brotherhood's established procedures. He developed a reputation within the group as an effective legal advocate, someone who could construct compelling cases even from minimal evidence, and Mayor Wickham increasingly relied on him to handle cases that required more sophisticated legal arguments. Cole found that he could separate his consciousness during these activities, performing the required duties while maintaining some internal sense of disconnection from the moral reality of what he was doing. He told himself that the defendants were genuinely guilty of the crimes charged, that frontier justice required harsh measures, that he was surviving in an impossible situation through necessary compromises. But late at night, when he was alone in his house, he would sometimes find himself weeping without quite understanding why, his body expressing anguish that his conscious mind had learned to suppress. In the spring of 1881, a young journalist named Daniel Morrison arrived in Redemption, claiming to be writing a series of articles about successful frontier settlements for a San Francisco newspaper. Morrison was 26 years old, ambitious, and possessed a dangerous combination of curiosity and naivety that made him willing to ask questions that more experienced travelers had learned to avoid. He had read federal census data that showed unusual population fluctuations in remote Texas settlements, with some towns reporting steady population growth despite the lack of immigration or natural birth rates that would account for such increases. Redemption had particularly interesting numbers. The town reported a stable population of 340 residents, but the number of deaths recorded in federal documents was far lower than statistical models suggested should be occurring in a frontier settlement of that size. Morrison suspected that Redemption might be underreporting deaths to avoid drawing attention to disease outbreaks or violence, and he arrived hoping to uncover a story about how frontier communities manipulated federal records to maintain their autonomy. Sheriff Thorne greeted the journalist cordially and arranged for him to stay at the town's boarding house, explaining that Mayor Wickham would be happy to provide information about Redemption's success and growth. But the sheriff also made sure that Morrison was never left unsupervised. assigning deputies to accompany him whenever he ventured into town, and ensuring that the journalist's interactions with residents were carefully controlled. Morrison conducted interviews with several citizens over his first 3 days in Redemption, hearing carefully rehearsed stories about the town's prosperity, the fairness of its legal system, and the strong sense of community that bound residents together. But on his 4th day, while being escorted through the courthouse to meet with Mayor Wickham, Morrison noticed something that would ultimately seal his fate and expose the Brotherhood's activities to the outside world. The courthouse kitchen was being cleaned by 2 workers, and through the open doorway, Morrison glimpsed a large table where meat was being processed, butchered with professional precision into cuts that would be suitable for cooking. What caught his attention was not the butchering itself, which would be normal enough in a frontier town, but rather the anatomical chart hanging on the kitchen wall. A detailed medical diagram showing not a cow or a pig, but a human body with various sections labeled and numbered. Morrison stopped walking, his escort deputy grabbing his arm and trying to pull him away, but the journalist had already seen enough to understand that something profoundly wrong was happening in Redemption's courthouse. He demanded to speak with federal authorities, claimed protection under press freedom, and threatened to publish accounts of what he had discovered unless he was immediately allowed to leave town. Sheriff Thorne arrived within minutes, listened to Morrison's demands with his characteristic emotional detachment, and calmly placed the journalist under arrest for trespassing in restricted areas of the courthouse and threatening town officials. The trial was scheduled for the following morning, Mayor Wickham presiding, and Dr. Cole was assigned to serve as prosecutor. That night, Cole sat in his office and finally acknowledged what he had become, not a survivor making necessary compromises, but an active participant in systematic murder who had crossed far beyond any possible moral justification. The journalist's arrival had forced him to confront the reality that the Brotherhood would continue operating indefinitely, processing anyone who threatened to expose their activities, and that his participation made him fundamentally no different from Sheriff Thorne or Mayor Wickham, despite his initial reluctance and continued internal anguish. He could prosecute Daniel Morrison, secure another conviction, participate in another ritual dinner, and continue his existence as a member of the Brotherhood until he died of natural causes or was himself eventually sacrificed for some real or imagined betrayal, or he could finally refuse, knowing that refusal would mean his own execution, but might somehow create an opportunity for Morrison to escape or for evidence of the Brotherhood's activities to reach the outside world. Dr. Cole spent that night writing a new journal, this time without any cipher, documenting in clear language every detail of the Brotherhood's operations that he had witnessed over the past 6 years. He included names, dates, specific descriptions of executions and subsequent processing, information about the extent of the Brotherhood's network across Texas, and his own role in prosecuting cases that led to these outcomes. The document ran to 47 pages written in his careful medical hand, and he signed it with his full name and title, understanding that this confession would be read either after his death or not at all. At dawn, before the trial was scheduled to begin, Dr. Cole walked to the town's telegraph office, which had been installed 2 years earlier when a line was finally extended to reach Redemption's silver mines. The telegraph operator, a young man named Peter Hayes who was not a Brotherhood member, was just opening the office when Cole arrived. The doctor handed Hayes a message addressed to the United States Marshal's office in Austin, explaining in terse language that federal crimes were being committed in Redemption and that immediate intervention was required. He included specific details about the Brotherhood's activities that would be sufficient to justify a marshal's investigation, and he instructed Hayes to send the message immediately and then leave town by any means necessary, as his life would be in danger once the Brotherhood learned what he had transmitted. Hayes read the message, his face going pale as he processed the information, and looked at Dr. Cole with a mixture of horror and confusion. The doctor simply nodded toward the telegraph key and said that he would stand guard at the door to ensure the message was sent before Sheriff Thorne could interfere. The transmission took less than 5 minutes, Hayes practiced fingers tapping out the coded message that would travel along copper wires to Austin, and when it was complete, Cole gave him money from his own pocket and told him to ride immediately for the nearest legitimate town where he could seek protection. Peter Hayes fled redemption within the hour, taking one of the town's fastest horses and heading east toward settled territory where the Brotherhood's influence couldn't reach. Dr. Cole returned to his office, placed his written confession in a prominent location on his desk where it would be easily found, and waited for the inevitable response to his actions. Sheriff Thorne arrived shortly before the trial was scheduled to begin. Entering Cole's office without knocking and standing silently for a moment, while observing the confession that sat openly on the desk, the sheriff picked up the document, read several pages with no visible emotional response, and then looked at Cole with something that might have been respect or might have been contempt. It was impossible to tell with Thorne's perpetually expressionless face. The sheriff explained calmly that Cole had just ensured his own execution, that the Brotherhood would now have to accelerate their timeline for processing current prisoners, including Daniel Morrison, and that federal marshals would arrive to find a peaceful town with no evidence of any crimes beyond the uncorroborated accusations of a physician who had clearly suffered some form of mental breakdown. Dr. Cole was arrested and charged with treason against the community, conspiracy to provide false information to federal authorities, and breach of his oath as a Brotherhood member. His trial was held that afternoon, with Mayor Wickham presiding and a hastily appointed prosecutor presenting evidence that Cole had been systematically fabricating accusations against innocent citizens due to mental illness brought on by his wife's death years earlier. Several Brotherhood members testified about Cole's increasingly erratic behavior, his paranoid accusations, and his evident delusions about cannibalistic rituals that had no basis in reality. The trial lasted less than 2 hours, and Cole was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging, to be carried out the following morning. Daniel Morrison's trial proceeded immediately afterward, and without Cole serving as prosecutor, Mayor Wickham handled the case himself, presenting evidence that the journalist had been working with Dr. Cole to fabricate stories that would damage Redemption's reputation and deny the town federal recognition. Morrison was convicted and sentenced to death as well, his execution scheduled for the same morning as Cole's. That night, the two condemned men were held in adjacent cells in the courthouse basement, and they talked through the darkness about their respective paths to this moment. Morrison explained that he had hidden copies of his notes about what he had seen in Redemption inside the binding of his Bible, which had been confiscated along with his other possessions, but might not be searched carefully if it was simply stored with his belongings. Cole told him about the telegraph message and his confession, explaining that even if they were both executed, there was now evidence in federal hands that might trigger an investigation. The two men prayed together as morning approached, Morrison leading them through hymns he remembered from his childhood, and when Sheriff Thorne came to escort them to the gallows, they walked calmly, having made peace with their fate. The double execution was attended by most of Redemption's adult population, and Mayor Wickham gave a speech about the necessity of defending their community against those who would destroy it through lies and conspiracy. Dr. Cole and Daniel Morrison were hanged simultaneously from a gallows that had been constructed with 2 platforms, and both men died quickly from broken necks, their bodies swaying in the early morning wind. But something unexpected happened that morning that would ultimately expose the Brotherhood's activities and bring their 12-year reign of terror to an end. Peter Hayes, the telegraph operator, had not fled toward settled territory as Dr. Cole had instructed. Instead, he had ridden to a nearby Apache camp and convinced the tribal leaders that Redemption's residents had been responsible for recent raids on Apache hunting grounds, providing false information that redirected the tribe's anger toward the town. The Apaches, who had been conducting increasing raids on Texas settlements in response to treaty violations and resource encroachment, saw Redemption as an appropriate target and planned their attack to coincide with the scheduled executions when they knew most of the town's population would be gathered in one location. The Apache raid began just as Dr. Cole's and Morrison's bodies were being cut down from the gallows, with approximately 40 warriors attacking from multiple directions and quickly overwhelming Redemption's minimal defenses. In the chaos that followed, several buildings caught fire, including the courthouse where the Brotherhood's ledger and all documentation of their activities were stored. Mayor Wickham died in the initial attack, struck by an arrow as he attempted to flee toward his office to rescue the ledger. Sheriff Thorne survived the raid, but was captured by the Apaches and taken into the desert. His ultimate fate unknown, though survivors later reported hearing his screams continuing for several hours after the warriors departed. The raid killed 23 residents of Redemption and drove away most of the remaining population, effectively destroying the town as a functioning settlement. When federal marshals arrived 3 days later in response to Dr. Cole's telegraph message, they found a burned-out courthouse, scattered bodies, and a traumatized population unable to provide coherent testimony about what had happened. The marshals conducted a brief investigation, concluding that Redemption had been the victim of an Apache raid, and that Dr. Cole's accusations about cannibalistic trials had likely been the delusions of a man suffering from frontier madness. Daniel Morrison's Bible was recovered from the ruins of the courthouse, and his notes were eventually delivered to his newspaper in San Francisco. The editor published a sensational article about the journalist's death during an Apache raid, mentioning his accusations about unusual judicial procedures in remote Texas settlements, but treating these claims as unverified allegations that couldn't be confirmed. The article generated brief public interest but was ultimately dismissed as frontier mythology, another exaggerated tale from the lawless territories that civilized society found simultaneously horrifying and titillating, but not quite credible enough to justify serious investigation. Ernest Holloway, the butcher who had processed bodies for the Brotherhood, survived the raid and eventually settled in El Paso, where he opened a legitimate meat market. He never spoke publicly about his time in Redemption, and he died in 1903 without ever facing legal consequences for his participation in the Brotherhood's activities. Several other Brotherhood members also survived and dispersed to various Texas towns, carrying with them both the knowledge of what they had done and the certainty that their activities would never be officially investigated or punished. The site where Redemption once stood is now empty desert, marked only by scattered foundation stones and the rusted remains of mining equipment. Local Apache legends speak of a cursed place where white men once practiced evil rituals, and traditional stories warn tribal members away from the location. Historians who have studied federal census records from the 1870s and early 1880s have noted the unusual population patterns that originally attracted Daniel Morrison's attention. But without physical evidence or credible testimony, these anomalies remain unexplained statistical curiosities rather than proof of systematic atrocity. In 1923, a researcher working in the archives of the San Francisco newspaper where Morrison had been employed discovered his original notes hidden in the Bible's binding, and these documents were eventually donated to a Texas historical society. The notes describe in specific detail what Morrison witnessed in the Redemption courthouse, including sketches of the anatomical charts and transcriptions of conversations he overheard. But historians have generally treated these materials as journalistic fiction or exaggeration rather than reliable historical evidence. Dr. Cole's confession was never recovered, presumably destroyed in the courthouse fire, and Peter Hayes disappeared into the territories after orchestrating the Apache raid, his role in Redemption's destruction remaining unknown until his own grandson discovered letters among family papers in 1947 that described what had actually happened. Some believe that the Brotherhood of Redemption was an isolated incident, a unique convergence of geographic isolation, lawless conditions, and a small group of psychopathic individuals who created a system that rationalized their sadistic impulses. Others suggest that Redemption represented something more disturbing, a glimpse into what human societies might become when stripped of external oversight and allowed to develop their own definitions of justice and morality. What is known as this: between 1869 and 1881, at least 47 individuals were executed in Redemption, Texas. following trials that meticulously observed legal procedures, while leading to outcomes that violated every principle of human dignity and civilized society. The brotherhood that oversaw these proceedings kept detailed records of their activities for 12 years, approaching systematic cannibalism with the same bureaucratic efficiency that legitimate governments apply to taxation or property registration. And when their activities were finally exposed, not through investigation or justice, but through violence and chaos, the evidence was destroyed and the perpetrators dispersed, leaving behind only fragmentary testimony and disputed documents that official history has largely dismissed as frontier mythology, too disturbing to be true. The legacy of redemption continues in academic debates about the nature of justice, the necessity of external oversight, and the ease with which ordinary moral constraints can be suspended when geographic isolation and ideological conviction combine to create closed communities accountable only to themselves. If you enjoyed this tale of dark history and want more stories about the hidden horrors of America's frontier period, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Leave a comment telling us what you think about the Brotherhood of Redemption and whether you believe such systematic atrocity could remain hidden for so long. Remember that the most disturbing stories are often those that official history prefers to forget, and that the truth about human nature is frequently more terrifying than any fictional horror. See you in the next video.